We're going to talk about chocolate buckeyes, which I would be a fan of. Anne's actually going to talk about the other buckeye, which is, kind of just as important, but the chocolate looks really good this morning. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ann Chanon, one of our OSU Extension educators out in the field in Lorain County. We're going to talk about buckeyes. Is it really more than just the state tree? I guess we'll find out. So with that, Ann, I'll stop sharing and let you take it away.
And good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for joining me this morning. So Kathy already sort of took my thunder away. So if we were in person, of course, I'd be asking all of you, when you hear the word Buckeye, what do you think of? And so some folks think of that confection, others think of a university mascot, our state tree. Some for Marnie, Buckeye Chuck, who will be making his appearance here in a couple of weeks. So obviously humans have had a long interaction with Aesculus going back to actually about 5000 BC. And they play a role in our art. So this happens to be an Impressionist painting from about 1868. And so this is called Gathering of Flowers in a French Garden. But in addition to that, we've seen Aeschylus play a role in Longfellow's poem, The Village Blacksmith. If you watch the movie Emma, Aeschylus were actually in some of those scenes in the backdrop. And it's the symbol that's in Kiev even to this day. So in terms, they play a role in our art. They've actually played a role in our politics, especially here in Ohio. It was during the election of 1840 when Ohioans first began calling themselves Buckeyes, at least on a national level. So this is William Henry Harrison. He called himself the log cabin candidate at the time, and that he lived in a log cabin made of Buckeye logs, and he drank hard cider. We're going to talk about why he probably wasn't in a Buckeye log cabin a little bit later. That's how he became known as the Buckeye State, and his supporters actually carved souvenirs out of Buckeye wood to show their support for him. So they played a role in our politics, but most importantly, and what we actually use Buckeyes for, Aesculus for today, is in our landscape. And this actually dates all the way back to when Christopher Wren was planting around Busheye Park in Great Britain. And so it lines many of the streets in London and of Paris. And in London, they still have to this day what's called Chestnut Sunday, which celebrates the Buckeye, or celebrates the Aesculus and all of its flowering. It contributes to, you hear about April in Paris. And so Aesculus play a key role in lining those streets of Paris and around the Louvre. Here we see Aesculus in the landscape as trees for public parks, golf courses. We see them occasionally as street trees on university campuses, and of course in private homes as well. And Buckeyes and Aesculus in general come in a range of sizes from very large trees to large shrubs and everything in between. We're going to talk about that in greater detail today. So what are our objectives for today? So we're going to talk a little bit about the relationships within and between Aesculus. We're going to talk about some key members of the genus. I know that we've had some questions about what makes for a good landscape plant. We're going to talk about the unique nature of the hybrids within Aesculus, some disease and insect concerns, and if you want to propagate one in your own home. So I put this up here. So humans always like to categorize things. So in terms of putting plants into categories, it goes kingdom, phylum, class, order. And so we see that Aesculus are in the order Sapindales, and they've been in that order continually. But what has changed is for many years, Aesculus were part of a 2 genera family called Hippocastaneaceae, and that was a standalone family. They're very closely related to Aceraceae, which we all know has Acer, which has got maples in it, which was also a standalone family. As we began to look more closely at genetic similarities, taxonomists have reclassified both of those families into Sapindaceae, which is the soap family. So they're now into this subfamily here. And then if we look over here under genera, we actually see Aesculus and the sister genera Bilia are together, but closely related to Acers and Diptonia. So you might at first glance think, what do Aesculus and Acers have in common, since maples always get all the good press? They actually have more in common than you might realize. So first, we see that both Aesculus and Acers have that opposite leaf and branch arrangement. If we look at the leaf here of, so this is a sugar maple leaf, we see that the veins in the sugar maple leaf are palmately arranged. And we see that they join at one point down to the petiole. Taken to a little bit further extreme, if we look at the next leaf over, and we're looking here at the Japanese maple, we see just how deep these lobes go in this Japanese maple leaf, almost beginning to look palmately compound. A little bit further, if we come here and we're looking at, this is the leaf of a paper bark maple, we see that we have 3 leaflets here, and they're in that same sort of palmately compound arrangement. And that, of course, is a key characteristic for all Aesculus. Aesculus are palmately compound, which means the leaflets join to the petiole at one point, and they're arranged much like each leaflet, like a finger of your hand joining into your palm. So that's how they're similar. They do have some differences, however. So when we think of Acer, we think of large clusters of small flowers, and they are scattered actually throughout the canopy of the tree. They're not located just at the ends of the branches, and that is characteristic of Aesculus. They will have their panicles, their groups of flowers, only at the ends of branches. And these are upright, generally somewhere between 2 and 16 inches in length, depending on which species we're talking about. And of course, the fruits are different. So with Acers, of course, we have our traditional samaras here. With Aesculus, we have a leathery husk, and that fruit contains usually, typically 1, but as up to as many as 6 seeds, although that would be very, very, very rare. So how are these things all arranged and connected with each other? So back in 1957, they began to try to bring some order to this genera. And up until then, there had been upwards of about 50 different described species. And as Hardin began to look at this, he began to realize that we're seeing lots of variability within many of these species. And so he began to classify and characterize. So he characterized 13 different species, and then within those 13 species, grouping them into 5 sections. So botanically speaking, plants that are within a section are more closely related than plants between sections. And when we're looking at doing some plant improvement, sometimes crossing between sections can be difficult, but crossing within a section is considerably easier. So you see here back in evolutionary times, we had a bilia-like ancestor that split off then to bilia and then to Aesculus. And then we can see as he saw it, and he did this all based on the morphology of the plants, both the leaves, the flowers, and the fruit. we follow that up with 2009. So this is basically looking at those phylogenetic relationships between Aesculus. And they're used both nuclear and chloroplast DNA to do this. So I know this is a bit of a busy slide, but I just wanted to show you that molecular data really supported the work that Hardin did back in the 1950s. You know, so we can see that we have the Asian clade here, which had all of the species he described, as well as a few others. Then we had the Macrothersus, which has bottlebrush buckeye, Arpavias, which represent our northeastern or our American eastern species. And then Aesculus, from which the genus gets its name, both the European common horse chestnut as well as the Japanese horse chestnut. And we can see that, well, here's Acer. And so we can see that there was a common ancestor, one that became the family or the group that we call Aesculus, and one that became the group that we call maples. So what features are common to Aesculus? So I know that this was one of the questions that was posed. So when talking about features that are common to all Aesculus, we're generally talking about that bold branching pattern. They tend to have stout stems, large buds. And those buds are mixed buds, as we can see over here to the right. This is working. We can see that these are newly emerging leaves, and we can see that we actually already have a very well-developed floral structure. So that's what the definition of a mixed bud. They bud out early. So when you're looking for those spring ephemerals, don't forget to look up, because some of those first leaves that are going to greet you are going to be those of Aesculus. As I said, the leaves are opposite, palmately compound. The margins are serrated. So sometimes that serration is even and fine, and sometimes it's actually quite uneven and quite deep. The panicles of blossoms are born at the tips of branches, so you're only going to see flowers on the outside. You do not see flowers on the inside in Aesculus. They're showy, and depending on the species, they start early in spring and can go through mid to late summer. So in northeastern Ohio, we're probably talking mid to late April through August, depending on the species. Down towards Cincinnati, I'm guessing that we're at least a month to 6 weeks earlier. So your Aesculus may start blooming the end of March, and that they may finish in July. Most of our Aesculus are diploids, which means they have only 2 sets of chromosomes, and they're known to align pretty well and go through that reproductive process. We do have one tetraploid, which I'm going to mention today. The fruit are capsules, and they have large seeds. And they have a couple of different characteristics. Important to know about the seeds, and we'll try and talk about this at the end of our presentation today. The seeds are what we refer to as recalcitrant, which means if those seeds are allowed to dry out for as little as a week to 10 days, they'll lose more than 70% of their viability. So they're very hard to store. So when you get those seeds in the fall, you definitely want to plant them right away. So those are the features that are held in common. Talk a little bit about the distribution. So as I said, we have the Asian group, which is Indica is here, Chinensis is here, Wilsonii is the blue, and Ascmica is probably our most tropical and evergreen, and certainly is not hardy in North America, found in Thailand and in other parts of Asia. We have Hippocastanum, which is over here in the southern part of Europe, and Turbinata, which is found in 3 islands in Japan. So we can see what looks to be a fairly disjointed distribution. And then if we look at the United States, we see a similar pattern. We see over on the West Coast, California Buckeye, which is found in the mountains. Perii, which is sometimes called Baja Buckeye, is found down here in Baja, California. And if we look at the eastern part of the United States, we're going to see 5 different species, which here we have Ohio, Here we have yellow. This is painted Buckeye here, designated in orange. Red Buckeye in the red, and then in the green is bottle brush. So we can see that some of those distributions are pretty large, but we have a whole portion of the United States where we don't see any Buckeyes currently living today. That does not, however, mean that we didn't have Buckeyes there in the past. So this was some work from Manchester in 2001, and they found both impressions of leaves as well as of fruits and seeds. And so this was found in North Dakota and then west into Wyoming. So this is another, what would be called a North American species. Just want to make sure that I haven't left any comments out on that. So, you know, when we're talking about that distribution and how those things are related, what we're really looking at is how could this come to be? So we know that, or at least it's been hypothesized, that a center of origin could be here in Asia. And if we actually look here, there's another proposed species here yet in southern China. Could this have been the center of origin? Could Aesculus then have migrated west into North America and ultimately all the way over to the East Coast? That's one theory. Another theory is that Aesculus during the Miocene period evolved and then migrated in two directions. One, east into Asia, the other, or west into Asia and then east across North America. So let's talk a little bit about Aeschylus India, or Aeschylus indica. So if you travel quite a bit, especially if you go out to British Columbia and you're there in June, this is a plant that might greet you, characterized by beautiful pink flowers, very, very showy. These panicles are about 16 inches, so quite large as far as Aesculus goes. Medium-sized tree, very limited in its climactic adaptability, however. So this is a plant that we find in zone 7 to 9, but this is a plant that can't take temperatures above 100 and definitely can't take cold either. So can be kind of limited in where you might be able to find it. It also grows quite well throughout Great Britain. So if you ever have a chance to travel to Kew Gardens and visit there in July, this is a plant that might be there to greet you. So I haven't had a chance to see this one in person myself, but certainly one that would be, if I had a bucket list of Aesculus to see, this certainly would be at the top of my bucket list for that. This is one that you will see here in Ohio. So this is Chinese horse chestnut. So this was brought in probably about 30 years ago at this point. Really limited in where you're going to see this, or you're going to see this typically at arboretums. Part of what this plant is characterized by are these petioles. So these petioles can be upwards of 18 inches long. These leaves, each leaflet being almost a foot. So you're going to get something that's going to be 2 to nearly 3 foot across. It gives you a very, very tropical feel. We look over here at the bud, and you'll see I've tried to portray most of the buds today with a coin to give you a feel for the size. This horse chestnut actually has the largest buds of all, and so also characterized by having that shiny and sticky surface to it. And Aeschylus Turbinata, so this is the Japanese horse chestnut. As I said, it can be found on 3 different islands. Typically in a more mountainous situation, this is going to be a very large tree. We are seeing this more and more used in our landscapes. So here we see a fairly young specimen. This is at Dawes Arboretum. Very characteristic of this is this unique sort of drooping leaflet arrangement. Pardon me. So this gives you a very, very tropical feel. These two are upwards of about 16 inches in length. So these are very large leaves, blooms usually about 3 weeks after common horse chestnut. So figure that if common horse chestnut is blooming, let's say the first week of May, this is probably going to be blooming that last week of May into that first week of June. Has creamy white flowers. Panicles are about 16 inches in length, so each one of these is an individual blossom. And with Japanese horse chestnut, the blotches, and we're going to talk quite a bit about blotches later, they actually change from red to deep purple. So different than what we see in some of the other of our native buckeyes here. And here's an example of a plant that horticulturists would love. So this is a variegated version of Japanese horse chestnut. So this is called marble chip. And you can see that the variegation is highly variable. And as with all variegated plants, this needs to be sited correctly because it will sun scorch. But it does give kind of a tropical feel, which is why people like many of the Asian species. They have these large, very, very tropical looking leaves. So here's California Buckeye. So this is one of our natives. So this is a native Californian. We can see over here, found predominantly in 2 mountain ranges. We'll find it, the largest ones in the Sierra Nevada mountains. This is a scrub type shrub to tree. And it takes what is common to all of the plants in the genus to an extreme. So this plant leaves out very, very early, as is common across the genera. Will go ahead and flower, but by midsummer will completely defoliate as a means of avoiding drought. And we see this characteristic in other Aesculus species, but this takes it to an extreme. So you're going to be left with a tree that has no leaves and just has fruit dangling off of it, kind of bobbing like apples at the end of a string. And you might wonder, how is this plant able to fill these fruit? Because their fruit are quite large, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 inches in diameter. Both the bark, which is light colored with a slight green cast, as well as the fruits themselves that are green, are known to be photosynthetically active. But it has shed all of those leaves in an effort to avoid drought stress. And so there is a close-up of its flowers. This is another one that's on my bucket list to see that I haven't had the opportunity to see in person, but you see just how flat and open all of these flowers are. And these panicles are also quite showy and quite long. Typically a white color with just a tinge of pink. There is actually also a pink cultivar, which is pretty much the domain of a couple of arboretums in Southern California. So how do we separate within Aesculus horse chestnuts from buckeyes? So horse chestnuts, they're typically the Asian and European species, predominantly very large trees. Key to identification is going to be resinous buds. So if you go up to Japanese horse chestnut, common horse chestnut, any of those Asian species, if you were to hold one of those buds, they would actually stick to your fingers. Typically, they're going to have 7 leaflets as opposed to 5. And the leaflets are sessile. What do I mean by that? We come over here, we see the leaflet, there's leaf tissue that comes all the way down to that point of connection with the petiole. So that's sessile. So petioles, which we see over here in buckeyes, those are absent. The flowers are bell-shaped. And what do I mean by that? They actually open, forming more of a bell-like shape, as opposed to being tubular, which we'll see with our North American species. And their fruits are very, very spiny. So the spines can be upwards of almost a ½ an inch in length. So obviously not something you want to be walking around barefoot with. And let's contrast that with Buckeyes. So Buckeyes actually was a designation given by an international group of horticulturists that determined that the North American species would be called Buckeyes. We have a range of sizes and shapes. We have trees to shrubs, from large trees to shrubs and everything in between. Critically, the buds are dry. So if you were to go up to a tree this time of year in the woods, if it's sticky, my first thought would be, are we looking at common horse chestnut? If the buds are dry, then we definitely would need to think more about which of the North American species we're talking about. Typically 5 leaflets, as we see pictured here. And we can see that those petioles are present. So that's this bit of tissue here. Hopefully you can see that with my pointer. That's a petiole. The petioles come together to join the petiole. And that's very key characteristic for all of our North American species. As I said, the flowers are what we refer to as tubular. So we have a well-defined calyx, and the petals extrude from that, from a tube-like structure. And the fruits are highly variable. They can be prickly. And what do I mean by prickly? Think cucumbers and the prickles that we might find on cucumbers, to warty or lumpy, all the way to a smooth fruit. Once again, we're going to see a range of colors within the seeds, all the way from a dark chocolate through to a honey color for our North American species. So what are the most common Aesculus you're going to run into in either the landscape or the woodlands here in Ohio? You're going to most commonly find the common or European horse chestnut, our Ohio buckeye, of course, yellow buckeye, red buckeye, which we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about as a landscape plant, painted buckeye, which we typically only see in arboretums, and then bottle brush buckeyes. So those are the ones we most commonly see here. And let's talk a little bit about common horse chestnut. So as I said, common horse chestnut, we see it throughout southern parts of Central Europe. We find it in the Balkans. We find it in places in Turkey and in Greece. We're talking about a very large tree. So we're talking about something that's going to be typically 50 or more feet in height, and usually around about a 30-foot spread. Often seen in parks. As I said, this was an important tree for Europe for many, many years, although we're going to talk about why that is unfortunately changing. Hardy to zones 3 to 7, so some of the most hardy of our Aesculus species. You can see the probably best here in the winter plant, that pyramidal shape that's characteristic of it. The bark is kind of a platy grayish brown, not very specific in its characteristic. You see the plant at 2 times of year. So these are the winter buds. They said those are very sticky and quite large. And just a few months later, there are the buds beginning to emerge for springtime. So let's take a closer look at those leaves. So each leaflet is obovate, which means the widest point is here. Coming down, as I said, they are sessile at the point of attachment with the petiole. In spring, one of the other characteristics you're going to find with common horse chestnut is this rust-colored pubescence. This actually will wear away by midsummer, so it's not something that we can rely on all year, but certainly something we can definitely look for in springtime. You can see here that characteristic 7-leaflet arrangement. Buds are quite predominant. You can see by the size and with the comparison to the dime here, going to be at least about 3/4 of an inch in size. Of course, this plant is quite popular because of its very, very showy flowers. Also pyramidal in terms of shape of the panicles. typically 10, maybe even 12 inches in length, usually about 4 inches across here. This actually is a good example, our first example of those blotches I was talking about. So as a flower newly opens, it will open with 2 blotches, typically light in color. Excuse me. And sort of a bright yellow. As that flower ages, then that's going to actually change from yellow to orange to sort of a deep red, almost purplish color. It is thought that these serve as recognition for pollinators to know which flowers are actively producing nectar. You can see up here in the corner, much closer close-up of an individual flower. We definitely can see where those petals have turned back, and that both the anthers and the pistils, so the reproductive structures, are very easily and clearly displayed. Typically takes, so this blooms in May, and these fruits and seeds are typically going to be upsizing off the tree sometime in probably September. And as I said here, we definitely can see some variability, but very characteristic of the spines or warts you would typically see. The fruit are pretty large, almost 1 inch to 1.5 inches in size. And that's where this tree gets one of its other common names. So the other common name for common horse chestnut, if we were in Great Britain, would be conker. And actually there's a game of the same name. So school children would take the mature seeds of common horse chestnut, they would put a string around them, and then you would take turns spinning them in the air and whacking the seeds together. And the person whose seed remained intact would be considered the winner. And so that's called the game called Conkers. So have never played that, but certainly is one of those unique sort of trivia features about common horse chestnut. So there, as I said, those seeds are definitely quite large. This plant is fairly tolerant to both salt in the soil as well as in the air, and to pollution. So that's one of the reasons why it was used throughout the cities of Europe. It is susceptible to the disease leaf blotch, which we're going to talk about later today, as well as leaf scorch, which is a physiological problem. They're usually characterized about 26 different cultivars. Those are typically available only in Europe, where they've actually been working on this plant for probably about the last 300 or 400 years. We know that the first record of common horse chestnut actually dates back to about 1556 or something like that. Of the cultivars, the one that you're going to most likely find here in the States is called Bomani. That is a double flowered form. So of absolutely no interest to our pollinators whatsoever. Each individual flower looks much more like a pom-pom. So both the anthers and the pistils have actually been converted into petals. And the flowers tend to last about 2 or 3 times as long because they're not reproductively competent. Unfortunately, that cultivar is also susceptible to leaf blotch and leaf scorch, which limit its use in the landscape. There are some other cultivars out there that have more lanceolate, meaning thinner leaves, but those are pretty rare. You're going to typically find those only in arboretums. So common horse chestnut often gets confused with our Ohio Buckeye. So we're going to talk about how you're going to tell those apart. We look at Ohio Buckeye, we actually see that there's a pretty broad range. So Ohio Buckeye is actually found in most of our Ohio counties, more predominantly in the north and western part of the state. You can see that its range extends west and down south. And this is important because where this is called Ohio Buckeye, there's a variant of Aeschylus glabra called Texas Buckeye, which we're going to talk a little bit about here in just a moment. So it was Micheaux who first coined the term Ohio Buckeye. So when he in about 1810 was surveying through the state of Ohio, this tree was so common, he began to call it the Ohio Buckeye, which is how it got its common name. And that's how he also became known as the Buckeye State. Typically, Ohio Buckeye is going to be found along bottomlands, starting over there in the western edge of Pennsylvania, down along the rivers, south into, as we can see south here, into parts of Alabama, and of course, as I said, west into Texas. This plant has a wider soil adaptability than other North American species. So this will take a soil pH of 6 all the way to about 7.5, and actually has a pretty broad hardiness from zone 3 all the way down to zone 9. So if we look at our Ohio Buckeye here, we see that it's kind of a medium-sized tree. Going to have a roundish shape to it. Typically, we're going to find it's going to be usually around 30, but can be up to about 50 foot in height and about 25 foot, 30 foot in width. Its wood is soft, so I know that we're talking to some of the foresters here today. And this is why I said William Henry Harrison probably was not sitting in a log cabin. We know both Ohio Buckeye and Yellow Buckeye have soft wood. In fact, Yellow Buckeye is referred to as the softest of the hardwoods, so does not make for good lumber. Its wood is typically used only for pulpwood. So what can we say about the bark? So the bark is a little bit on the dark side. It's definitely going to be rough and warty and with these dark scales. Leaflet, typically about 6 or so inches across. Each leaflet itself is going to be 3 to 4 inches. You very clearly see our petioles here. Note that the the petiole is green, and that's going to be a key identification characteristic. Buds, if you go to look at the buds this time of year, are going to be, as I said, dry and sort of a light color. Did I miss a? Guess I didn't miss it. I was going to say I thought I had missed a slide. Yeah. All right. It is one of the notes I had put here. This is one of our among our first trees to leaf out into bloom in spring. So as I said, when you're looking for those spring ephemerals, this is definitely one of the trees to look for when this begins to leaf out. Its leaflets are typically going to have a bit of a bronze color to them, quickly turning into this sort of medium green. Characteristic of the flowers, they are yellow-green in color. There are 4 petals. And we can see, very importantly, we see that the anthers are extended past the petals. And that is a key characteristic to tell Ohio Buckeye from Yellow Buckeye. Flowering starts here at the center of what this is called a rachis and blooms out towards the edge, and typically starts at the bottom of the panicle, working towards the top. True of all Aesculus, these are called andromonaceous, meaning that there are 2 types of flowers that are present. We see the predominance of flowers are functionally staminate, meaning that they have anthers, but not a functional pistil. And then a smaller portion of the flowers are actually complete, meaning that they actually can set seeds. And we can see here in this particular panicle, out of all of these flowers, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and probably 7. So only 7 out of all the flowers that we can see on that panicle are actually going to be capable of setting seeds. So the fruit are usually about 1 inch to about 2 inches. They are kind of that yellow tan color that you see here. You can see where this is considered warty. As I said, sometimes you definitely will find prickles sticking out of these, and that's one of the ways that it gets conflated with common horse chestnut. People see prickles and they think, oh, it must be an Ohio Buckeye, when in fact they're more spiny and it's common horse chestnut. The seeds are small in comparison to common horse chestnut. So common horse chestnut's probably going to be about 2 inches across, and the hilum, which is the light spot, is going to cover about half of that seed. Here we can see with Ohio Buckeye, the seeds are about quarter size. They are dark chocolate to deep mahogany in color. So there's a little bit of a range, and typically quarter size. And that hilum, that light spot, is typically only about a quarter of the seed coat. And that is the where Buckeyes come from. The common name comes from. Native Americans thought that the seeds of the North American species, being that the seed coat was dark with a light spot, reminded them of a buck's eye. So that's where Buckeye comes from. So yellow Buckeye, so that's going to be the other species that we find growing natively here in Ohio, predominantly along the southern, eastern southern third of our quarter of our state, into West Virginia, parts of the Carolinas, the Tennessee Valley, parts of Kentucky, and here along the Ohio River. This is the largest of our native Buckeyes, so this is going to be a very large tree, similar in size to horse chestnut. So that's how one of the ways it gets confused with common horse chestnut is the size of the tree itself. A couple of the other names, so I should go back just one, which is, remember one of the other names for Ohio Buckeye is fetid Buckeye. So if you were actually to crush these leaves or crush these stems, it's going to have a very distinct smell to it, which we do not have with yellow Buckeye. We look at these trees, are quite large. As I said, they're usually 60 to 75 foot in height, with about 50-foot spread. Their bark is more smooth, lighter in color than either common horse chestnut or Ohio Buckeye. Buds, you can see, are quite large and quite well developed in probably maybe 1/4 of an inch larger, maybe 3/8 of an inch larger than Ohio Buckeye. But if we look at this leaf in terms of size is very comparable to common horse chestnut, but differs in several key ways. So if we look at the leaflet shape, we see that the leaflet is more oval as opposed to being wider here at the tip, which was what we saw with common horse chestnut. And these leaves tend to droop, whereas a common horse chestnut leaf will be very stiff and will be held out straight. As we see here, these leaflets hang quite gracefully, giving it a very soft appearance as opposed to the stiff appearance that we see with common horse chestnut. Here we can see the panicles of flowers. So these flowers are typically about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in length. Ohio Buckeye is going to be more of a greenish yellow. These tend to be more of a true yellow in color. If we look closely, we see that the calyx, which is this structure here, is typically light green, but then the petals are typically a light butter yellow. If we look at the panicle here, we can see that Of all of the Aesculus, this has some of the densest panicles in terms of its flowers. And this is a newly opening panicle. And we can see that these flowers probably range in age from newly opened here to flowers like this one that probably is about 5 days old. So it usually takes about that long for it to go from being freshly opened, just beginning to shed its pollen, to being ready to upsize off. And we can see that within this panicle, especially, all of the flowers that we're seeing here are functionally staminate. We don't see the emergence of any complete flowers yet, and that's because this is a newly opening panicle. Key to help you identify this from Ohio Buckeye is if we look down here at the lower right and we look at this flower, we can see that we have the two petals, the two longer petals that point up, and we have the two lower petals forming the four, forming that tubular structure. But unlike Ohio Buckeye, where the anthers are pushed out and extend past the petals, here we see that the anthers are either even with the petals, or what we call included, which means inside. So hopefully that's clear to all of you. And here we can see there's another good example here of just one anther about even with petals and the rest of them being within inside that panicle structure. Panicles are pyramidal, typically somewhere about 4 to 8 inches in length and about 4 inches in width. Of all of the North American species, this is the one that is most resistant to blotch and scorch, meaning that it has a little bit wider application, but this tree is a large tree, so it definitely requires a large space and probably does not make for a very good street tree. So it produces these very, very large fruits. So these can be upwards of about 3 inches in diameter. Almost always, about 60% of the time, they have only one seed per fruit. You can see here the size of the seed that would have been within this fruit here. Typically with Ohio Buckeyes, we would find somewhere around 60 seeds per pound. With yellow Buckeye, we find only about 25 to 30. So we see that the seeds are about twice the size. In terms of color, here we can see one of the key characteristics. The fruit is smooth, unlike Ohio Buckeye, which is warty, or common horse chestnut, which is spiny. So this has got a smooth fruit coat. Seeds are chestnut colored. So think a warm mahogany, for example, would be a good way to describe that. So Ohio Buckeyes are very dark chocolate. This is more of a chestnut brown, mahogany brown color. And we're going to compare that to another Buckeye here in a minute. So one of the other things that's really nice about yellow Buckeye is it's got, it can have very good fall color. So its fall color can range from this golden yellow that we see here to a really warm orange. So this is going to be limited by if we have a very dry summer. Of course, we're not going to get that good fall color, but it has been described as looking like warm pumpkin orange. And this particular tree, I was following this tree most of this fall, and we can see that we're just coming into fall color here, and we see that brilliant orange. And by the time this part of the tree had colored, these leaves had fallen off, so I couldn't get a perfect picture of a yellow Buckeye with beautiful fall color, but we definitely can see that beautiful characteristic orange here in the middle. So that brings us to red Buckeye. So this is our most southern of our Eastern North American species. You see that we find it in Florida, throughout the Carolinas, the southern part of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, into Louisiana, Arkansas, and parts of Texas. So fairly wide range in terms of its southern scope. Definitely not up into Ohio natively, although it is perfectly hardy here. It is hardy to about zone 5. A small tree, so that's one of the reasons why it makes a good landscape plant. The tree over here on the left was on the OSU campus in Columbus for many years, and at this particular point in time, this tree was about 40 years old, was about 20 or so foot in height, and about 12 foot in spread. This is an example of one that was not limbed up, so much more almost of a shrub type here, and about the same height, probably about 20 foot in height. And here it probably was closer to about 20 foot in spread. So in comparison to the other ones that we've looked at so far, we can see how much smaller the buds are for red buckeye. So they're considerably smaller than what we saw with either Ohio, and especially as compared with yellow. And it typically forms a rounded crown as opposed to an oval crown that we saw with yellow buckeye, or a larger rounded crown that we saw with Ohio. So here we see the leaves as they first emerge in spring. So here's those bronze leaves. Another good example of a well-developed panicle. So as these leaves are emerging, we see that the flowers are already not only formed, but very, very well developed. Typically, this plant will bloom somewhere around 3 weeks after leaf emergence. Ohio, it's typically a little bit shorter than that. We look here at the leaf up close. We can see that we have those oval shaped leaflets. Leaflets are comparable in size, and leaves are comparable in size to Ohio buckeye. So being somewhere around 6 to maybe 8 inches across. Characteristically, we see a red petiole. So in red flowered forms of red buckeye, that red petiole is a good diagnostic feature to separate those leaves from Ohio buckeye. If you were to crush this leaf, it does not have that characteristic Ohio buckeye smell to it. Over here, we see a fairly young tree, and this is characteristic not only of red buckeye, but of all buckeyes. They tend to begin to bloom fairly young in life, so they actually will start usually around year 10 or so, and beginning to flower. So this tree is so small as to not even be characterized for its wood use. So whereas Ohio and yellow have some characteristic as pulpwood, this doesn't even rank to that extent. This is a good plant for the, and typically found in the woodland areas along the edges of the woods. So the flowers can be pretty variable in color. So here we see everything from sort of a brilliant scarlet, more of a pinkish color, to kind of a more soft red. This is a really good example of when I was talking about those staminate and complete flowers here. We see we only have anthers present, and in the complete flower, not only do we have the anthers present, but we have a well-developed style, and the stigmatic surface is here. So any pollinator that's going to want access to the nectaries at the base of the flower is going to be passing back and forth across both the pollen and the stigmatic surface of a complete flower. Panicles are a lot looser, so if you remember how tight the yellow buckeye panicles were in terms of flowers, here we see a lot more space between the individual flower beds. Also very characteristic, so they're going to start blooming base to tip. Only about 10% of red buckeye flowers are actually reproductively competent. So a typical panel is going to have, let's say, between 100 to 150 flowers on it, which means only about 10 or 15 of those flowers are going to be able to actually set and develop seeds. These red tubular flowers are very attractive, especially to ruby-throated hummingbirds. So very often you will hear them squeak, and you'll hear their wing beats if you are around a red buckeye when it's in full flower. So its fruit are smooth in the same way that we find with yellow buckeye. Fruits are considerably smaller. So they're about half the size of the fruits that we see with yellow buckeye. So whereas that fruit, the yellow buckeye fruit, might limit its use as a street tree or even as a park tree as a potential hazard, here these fruits are far less of a hazard to anybody that might be in the area. And this is very characteristic of red buckeye. So its fruit are smooth, its seeds are honey colored, and its seeds are about the same size that we find with Ohio buckeye. So I always find it really interesting when I see people wearing those buckeye necklaces that are so common, and I see our really, really large seeds with a really large hilum. I'm like, well, those are common horse chestnuts. If I see chestnut or mahogany colored large seeds, I'm like, well, those were yellow buckeyes. Those were not Ohio buckeyes. And if I see necklaces that have a mixture of these lighter honey colored seeds, I'm like, well, those weren't Ohio buckeyes either, because Ohio buckeyes are going to have that characteristic dark brown color. This is one of the variants. So this is why I always tell folks that if you're going to be buying a red buckeye, to go look for it in springtime, because this variety is called discolor. And what you see is, let's go back. So if we look here, in any of the red flowered forms, not only is the calyx here red, but the petals themselves are red. And here we have a bit of just a touch of yellow, but especially if we look at this one here, the entire petal is, or here, the petals are a deep red color. If we look at discolor, the calyx is a lighter pink, but the petals themselves are yellow, and they call it suffused with red, which means the veins within the petals are red. Note here that the petiole is green. So if you're looking at a red, what's termed a red buckeye, and you see that you have a green petiole, that's one that you actually want to be sure to take a close look at, because you could be getting flowers that are going to be yellow to pink as opposed to a deep red color. It brings us to painted buckeye, which has the smallest range of any of our Eastern North American species. And so we see it in the Piedmont region here, northern parts of Georgia and Alabama, and along this river basin. This is the smallest of the what we'll refer to as the tree species. And I don't have a whole lot of pictures of these. Think of this as probably only maybe maxing out about 15 feet in height. Flowers can be variable, but typically they will have those extended anthers. Crush these leaves, no fetid odor associated with them. What's really interesting and how the plant got its common name is you will find when a flower first opens, the petals are going to be sort of a light yellow, almost peachy color. And as those petals age, they become darker and darker pink. So you're going to have everything from a light yellow to a dark pink. So each flower is going to be unique. And then within that flower are going to be those blotches, which are also going to change from gold to red. So it gives you kind of with each flower looking different within the panicle, gives you that sort of painted look, like each flower is unique. So here we can see an example of 7 leaflets here, although 5 and 7 are both equally common among painted buckeyes. And once again, fairly small buds. I don't have a picture of the fruit of this. The fruit of painted buckeye is going to be a smooth and small fruit. And I'm guessing that the number of fruit is probably going to be similar to what we see with Ohio and and red in terms of about 60 fruit per pound. And finally, the last of the North American species is going to be Bottlebrush Buckeye. It has absolutely the smallest range of any of our Buckeye species in North America, pretty much found within the state of Alabama and just touching into parts of Georgia. This is a plant that is used and is valued for the fact that it blooms in early summer into midsummer, has very showy panicles of flowers. Typically, it's going to be 6 to maybe 10 foot in height, and it's going to be somewhere usually 10, maybe even 15 foot spread over the course of time. Good news about this plant is if you need to control its size, you can definitely cut it back and it will come back from the base. Here you see it used in a couple of different landscape situations. So its leaves will emerge sort of a purplish bronze color. Its panicles are far less developed. You will see little tiny panicles, but not certainly as well developed as what we saw with our spring blooming species. The petiole here is wine colored. You can see very good develop of the petioles here. More graceful, so similar in terms of its graceful habit, similar to that of yellow buckeye. And of fall color, because this plant is very, very resistant to both blotch and scorch, has consistently the best fall color among our Aesculus to date, and is this brilliant bright yellow that we see down here in the lower right. Has the smallest buds, and these buds are only about 1/4 of an inch compared to some of those larger buds we saw with our other species. Panicles can be extremely showing and are pretty variable in size. So there is a cultivar where the panicles themselves are, as you see, more than 2 foot in length. These will usually take on, as the flowers begin to open, sort of a graceful and arching habit. Among the straight species, panicles are usually about 12 to 14 inches in length. Typical panicle is going to have somewhere around 400 flowers, and that was a big part of my doctoral work. I did doctoral studies looking at both red buckeye and bottlebrush buckeye. And so of this, less than 1% of these flowers are complete. So when you're looking for ones to set seeds on, you have to look pretty closely. Panicles are more conical as opposed to pyramidal that we saw in a lot of our other species. And you can see over here how it got its common name of bottlebrush. So it has 4 white petals, and they are pure white. They do not have those blotches to indicate nectary maturity. And the stamens will extend out 3, very often 4, and even more times those lengths of the length of the petals. And so here we actually can see pretty characteristically how that can begin to look like we have bottle brushes. Once again, blooming from the bottom, from the base to the tip. Favored again by hummingbirds and a whole array of other pollinators. Fruit are smooth, typically found at the ends of the panicles. And once again, honey colored, and so very similar in color to Aeschylus pavia, red buckeye. So if we look at these overlapping ranges, this is actually key to the variability that we see. So very often if you go out into the woods and you try to key out a buckeye, you can get to a certain point and then you're going, well, I'm not quite sure what it is. And there have been actually a number of studies, both Pamphilus and Burton did extensive work looking at gene migration within Aeschylus populations. So if we look here, we can see places where yellow and Ohio overlap, yellow and painted, yellow and red, red and red in Ohio, and all possible combinations here pretty much in the Tennessee Valley. And so that's resulted in lots and lots of naturally occurring hybrids as well as some garden hybrids. So all of these that we see here above the green line have all been characterized either genetically or morphologically as all of these possible combinations. And we know that within the spring blooming North American species, all possible combinations occur. So just like we see crossing within the red oak group or within various forms of maples, that's what we're seeing here. And so it's quite possible to see an individual specimen that's going to have characteristics of both Flama and Pavia. That would be a hybrida. And we know that among these naturally occurring hybrids, they've been very often been characterized multiple times. So both Sargent and Ryder, who were working in the early 1900s to characterize plants of North America, would, every time they came across something that was just a little different, they named it as a new species, where in fact, we now know that these are interspecific hybrids. So we see that this is just a partial list. These are the ones that are recognized by USDA, and we see that we have both two parents and also tribrids as well. The two below the green line, so Aeschylus carnea, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute, is probably one of the best known of all of the Aesculus hybrids. And it's a cross between common horse chestnut and our red buckeye. And then Pollinators, which is a cross between common horse chestnut, and it's a back cross to a cross with carnea. So who is responsible for doing all of this? So largely our little friend here, the ruby-throated. I can never keep a ruby-throated hummingbird either on screen or I've actually never been able to photograph one either in a pavia or on a parviflora. They just moved too fast for me to get a good shot. But we the work is actually, it's really some very elegant research that has followed the migration of the ruby-throated hummingbird and the integration of and the bloom of Aesculus across North America. And so we know as the Aesculus begin to bloom, starting in the southern part of the range of red buckeye, all the way through the northeastern part of Ohio, as the Aesculus bloom, so do the hummingbirds migrate. Another pollinator over here we can see is the hummingbird moth. And so we know that that is also another important pollinator, particularly of our North American species and of our bottlebrush buckeye as well. We have a myriad of butterflies. So we know that we've got some couple of different kinds of swallowtails, and I've yet to be able to identify this little fella here. He was a small little butterfly, maybe only about an inch or so in size, but they're very attracted to, particularly in parviflora, where they can get access to the nectar at the base of the flowers. Variety of bees also come. So we can see that we have a bumblebee here on horse chestnut, common horse chestnut. We see another bumblebee here on this is yellow buckeye, honeybees, and other bees. So quite a wide array of pollinators. And then in addition to that, there are a host of other bee species that I would rely on the expertise of my colleagues to help me identify, but obviously important source of both nectar and pollen for those pollinators. So what results of all of this work of our insect and bird friends? So here's a wide array of some of those characterized hybrids. I just put this up here so you can see the similarities between many of the flowers. So typically we rely on flowers to help us identify species. And so you can see, even if we're comparing between hybrida and bushii, the flowers themselves are very, very similar. and very similar in characteristic to what we would see with Ohio Buckeyes. So understanding and teasing apart these hybrids can be quite a bit of work. If we look over here, so this is one of the important hybrids. This is a Colornoldia. So this was first characterized out of the Arnold Arboretum. And we can see that the flowers are probably most similar to yellow Buckeye in terms of their shape and characteristics, but a bit more, well, that yellow is tinged with a bit of pink here. Here are a couple of others. So this is Mutabilis. So this is another example of one. So this is a Pavia by Sylvatica. These tend to have sort of a salmon color as it's described in the literature, and more of that enclosed flower that we would have seen with yellow Buckeyes. So as I said, it can be very difficult to tease apart all of these individual hybrids. Most of the pictures that you've seen here, if you want to go look at an absolutely outstanding collection of Aesculus, is to visit the Dawes Arboretum in spring. And I wanted to acknowledge all of their good work and their generosity in letting me go and take pictures and actually use their facilities as part of my doctoral work along the way. And over here we see Wurlitziensis, and at first blush that might look like a red Buckeye to you, and in fact it's got red Buckeye in it, it's got Pavia in it, but it also has both Flava and Sylvatica. And these now have been fairly well characterized when people have looked at their DNA, and they've looked at the integration of all of those genetics. So here's one that you might find. So we're talking about plants for the landscape. So Pavia is an excellent small tree from the landscape. So is this cultivar called Autumn Splendor. It's one of the most widely available of all of the Aesculus cultivars on the market. It's going to be in that same, maybe just slightly larger than a red Buckeye. So this is going to be maybe in that 20 to 25 maybe on the outside. It might go up to about 30 foot in height. Oval in crown, as you can see here. Light colored flowers. So you can definitely see that yellow-green flower color. So definitely getting its flower color and shape from its glabra parent. But importantly, among Aesculus, it has excellent leaf health. So the leaves are the same size as a Ohio Buckeye, stiff. So they don't have that drooping habit that we see with Flava. So smaller, stiffer leaves, but shiny, as you can see here. In fact, they're almost hard to photograph sometimes, but very resistant to leaf blotch, which is the major limiting factor about using one of these in our home landscapes. The other benefit of having good leaf health is you will see fall color. So we know that glabra has the tendency to have red fall color if the leaves are allowed to develop and not be impinged by leaf disease. We saw the orange color that came from Flava. Here we see something that's intermediate. So this is was developed out of the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And one of its selection characteristics was to look for this kind of nice, kind of orangish red fall color. So this is probably the most popular of all of the hybrids that I was talking about. So this is red horse chestnut. This is one of the most commonly grown trees in all of England. Highly valued for its floral display in spring. So everything from a light pink to a darker pink. Characteristic, its leaves have that sort of twisted look about them. And we're talking about that uneven serration. So most of our North American species have that very nice, very even serration. Here you can see that this has a more jagged serration here. Typically in spring, it will have a pink petiole that will change over the course of summer a little bit. Buds are only slightly resinous, so halfway between the very resinous nature of common horse chestnut and the smooth nature of red buckeye. And so that's the parentage of red horse chestnut. It's a cross between common horse chestnut and red buckeye. And that's why it's so prized. So it has these beautiful pink panicles, typically pyramidal, so it gets that shape from the common horse chestnut. Also get the individual flower shape. They have these lovely open bell shapes. Good examples here of those blotches going from gold to light orange to a dark orange. Very uncommon for this tree to actually set seed. And this is the example of the tetraploid. So this actually has 2 complete sets of chromosomes, one coming from horse chestnut, one coming from red buckeye. So this is called an allotetraploid. So it typically will not cross with any other Aesculus that we have in the landscape. And as I said, it rarely sets seed with itself. I had to put this one in for Kathy. So this is definitely a plant only a horticulturist would love. She would, as a forester, just shake her head than anybody would keep this. So this is a hybrid called, this is Aeschylus Neglecta. And so this has got a couple of different parents to it. Common name for this is sunrise horse chestnut. Its leaves emerge and they are sort of this almost flamingo pink is how it's typically described, with pink petioles. This eventually, it only holds this color for about 3 weeks, and the leaves eventually turn into kind of a light greenish yellow. This is a plant that is susceptible to scorch if it's not given a proper amount of shade. It's extremely slow to grow because it's got very a low amount of chlorophyll, but it definitely is a plant a horticulturist would love. It actually received the Award of Merit from the Royal Horticultural Society, and is one that we typically would find much more commonly in Europe than we do here, although it is grown by one of our local nursery folks here in the state of Ohio. So in terms of climatic requirements, Aesculus will typically thrive in a pH of about 6 to 7. As I said, Ohio Buckeye can tolerate a pH up to about 7.5. Bottlebrush Buckeye prefer a slightly more acidic soil, really preferring to be about 6.2 to 6.5. All of the species that we've talked about today would thrive in our current climate here in terms of both hardiness zones for both cold and heat. Typically, we like to actually seat our larger species, so our Ohio Buckeye and our yellow Buckeye are considered to be shade tolerant. They're found growing in and among trees, both sugar maples as well as beech and American elm. Painted Buckeye, red Buckeye are much more a woodland edge plant, and they prefer to have their heads in the sunshine and their roots in the shade. Important for all Buckeyes, they have a very coarse root system, and so their ability to translocate water is not as good as some of our other tree species. So it is important when the trees are young that we give them some supplemental water to get them started, to help them become established. But we know that if plants are subjected to extended periods of drought, that they are going to follow suit as to what we saw with California Buckeye. They will defoliate, and it is possible to see Aesculus pavia or red Buckeye or Ohio Buckeye completely defoliated in late August, for example, just as a means to avoid that drought stress. So they take advantage of the fact that they leaf out early in spring when water's typically abundant and there's less competition for sunlight in the forest or at the woodland edge. And then when competition becomes intense and water becomes limiting, they'll lose their leaves. In terms of maintenance, it is important because we are talking about an opposite branched plant, that when the plants are young, you do give them some pruning to give them good structure, to give them a good establishment. Diseases are important for Aesculus, and we're going to talk about a couple of them. So most important of all of the diseases is Colornoldia Aesculus, which is the causal organism for leaf blotch. So leaf blotches actually can start very, very early in spring. And you can see here, these are some initial infections, and they start as these small little yellow spots. As the infection intensifies, these spots then begin to coalesce together. They always have this, or typically have this yellow margin to them, and then begin to form these larger brown areas. So this is actually what becomes limiting for planting Aesculus in the landscape. So if you get, this is common horse chestnut we see over here on the right, as these spots coalesce together, these leaves can become contorted. And in fact, one author actually described the leaves of common horse chestnut in the Midwest as taking on the appearance of a brown paper bag. So certainly that's not necessarily something that we would want in the landscape. Good news is, however, with at least in more mature specimens, we know that while unsightly, this disease is not fatal to any of the Aesculus. Anthracnose is a more spring type disease, as you might expect. Here we see this is a leaf of Aeschylus carnea that's been infected. Typically, we find this is going to be true on lower branches, more interior. So of course, you know, the same things that we would find whether we were talking about anthracnose in oak or anthracnose in maple, those same things apply with Aesculus as well, although it is a different organism. One thing that we do not want to see here in the United States, but which has become an issue of pretty grave concern in Great Britain and actually throughout all of Europe, is bleeding canker. So this is fairly recently characterized. This is a bacterial disease. It causes these large cankers, which then weep not only more bacterial spores, but in the plant's attempt to try to ward off infection, this will become fatal. So it is reported that at least 50% of all of the common horse chestnuts, the red horse chestnuts, and other Aesculus in Great Britain have been affected by bleeding canker. And I will plead with all of you, it is very, very easy for all of us to go online and to be looking at trees and plants from anywhere and not realize that a source for those plants might not be the United States. So it is incumbent upon you to know where those plants are coming from and to deal only with reputable producers within the United States so that we don't import yet another, what could be very, very devastating disease into the United States. But that's true for all of our plants, not just Aesculus. Be sure that you know where your plants are coming from and that they're healthy. There are a couple of insects which will feed. So these are, one is a native and one is, I guess at this point, a naturalized insect in, at least in our part of Ohio. So occasionally we'll get an outbreak of the white tussock moth, which will feed on the leaves, as do Japanese beetles. Once again, they typically are not considered to be devastating to plant health. Buckeye Lace Bug is another one that we will see. Very often we'll find this one on Ohio Buckeyes, although I have seen it on red Buckeyes as well. And what a homeowner will typically see is this sort of stippling effect, not realizing that what they need to do is to turn that leaf over. And here we see the nymphs busily feeding on the underside of the leaves and also leaving waste material behind as well. This is another pest, and another one that we definitely do not want to be imported here into the States. So this is On common horse chestnut, we can see that chestnut leaf miner is busy feeding on these leaves. There is a thought that it is a combination of this pest along with the bacteria that is causing the demise of Aesculus across Europe, in terms that you've lost photosynthetic area, the tree is already weakened, and then the bacteria comes in, and the tree is more susceptible to that. So I want to contrast leaf blotch with leaf scorch. So leaf scorch is physiological. There's not a causal agent. If we were to look at a leaf blotch and we were to look at the underside of the leaf with a hand lens, we would see black structures, which are the fruiting structures of the fungus. If we look at these leaves and we look at the undersides, we're not going to see those black structures. Characteristic of leaf scorch, it is either going to start at the leaf margins as characterized here, or at the leaf tips. It is thought that this is the result of the fact that the plant cannot move a sufficient amount of water to keep up with the water that is being transpired from the leaves. And of course, the furthest leaves and the furthest leaf points from that water source are going to be those that are going to be impacted first. This can cause whole leaves to eventually curl under and turn brown. If you begin to see this, it's a good sign for you to actually go out there and give some supplemental water to your plant. And as you can see, this is an Ohio Buckeye here with these little tiny fruits. So this actually is, this physiological leaf scorch actually started probably in June. And you can see if that actually progressed throughout the summer, why the leaves might take a brown and curled appearance. So how does this, how do we interact here with wildlife? So if you have deer problems, good news. Aesculus are fairly deer resistant. So they have a combination of compounds we're going to talk about here in a minute, which make them a not favored species for feeding upon. The seeds are gathered up by gray squirrels, other squirrels, seven-striped ground squirrels, aka chipmunks. You will, if you're wanting to collect Aesculus seeds, be fighting against the squirrels to collect those seeds. They will very often go and cleave off the fruit before the fruit has begun to open. And that's typically when we as horticulturists or home gardeners or even foresters, if we were to collect seeds, we want to wait for that pod to that fruit to just begin to open. Interestingly enough, squirrels don't typically eat the seeds that they gather in the fall. They will just gather them and then they will feed on them in winter and into spring. Why is that? So there are actually two compounds within Aesculus that are quite bitter. So one is a saponinoid and the other one is a coumarin. And these are both very bitter compounds. These are the two compounds that make Aesculus a poisonous plant. And so if you have small children, if you have an inquisitive pet, Aesculus might not be a good selection for you because all parts of the plant, the leaves, the stems, the seeds, as well as the roots, all contain both essin and esculin. So these are two compounds that have had some ethnobotanical uses among native populations. Seeds were tossed into slow-moving bodies of water to cause fish to come to the top, to make them easier to harvest. But then the fish needed to be leached to remove these two compounds. So these two compounds are water soluble. So you can begin to see why if you buried those Aesculus seeds in the fall with winter leaching, that these compounds could be leached out, therefore making the seeds edible for our wildlife in winter and into spring. The seeds are about 80% carbohydrate, so they're carbohydrate rich. Native peoples took advantage of that during times of famine by collecting the seeds and then leaching out both of these compounds, thus making them safe to eat. Otherwise, they would be toxic. And what if you wanted to have one of these in your own yard? So certainly you can go to a good nursery and you can buy an Ohio Buckeye, you can buy a yellow Buckeye. But I think it's a fun thing to do with, especially if you have children in your life and you want to actually raise a tree of your own, to say that you have an Ohio Buckeye born and bred. You can go to collect the fruit. As I said, you want to wait for this fruit to actually begin to open. Then you want to actually remove this husk. So it's important that that's actually removed. You can see here, so this is a red Buckeye seed here. You want to take a close look at that seed and you want to look for this. So this is actually what's going to become the radicle and the shoot. So this is where the embryonic region is. And you want to make sure that the hilum is down and that this is pointing down so that you get good root development going down. So Aesculus will produce a major primary taproot, very coarse, almost carrot-like, before it begins to produce the shoot. So Aesculus, very similar to our oaks, very, very often will produce a radicle in late fall and early winter. The shoot remains dormant, and then it's only after a period of cold that shoot will go ahead and develop. If you were putting these into if you wanted to start this for yourself, you could collect these seeds, put them into a zip top bag with some barely damp peat moss, and you want to have only a few seeds. So as I said, these seeds are recalcitrant. So that means their metabolism is going at a fast clip. So you don't want to have too many seeds grouped together. And you need to give them cold. So you need to give them about 120 days of cold. So somewhere between 90 and 120 days is optimal. And then you're going to get good radical emergence and then good shoot emergence. And just like with oaks, the cotyledons remain within that seed coat, nourishing that developing seedling, but never actually emerging. So when the shoot emerges, it emerges and only produces true leaves here. Trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to say about that. Oh, one other thing you want to do, if you are going to be planting these outside and the cotyledon and the seed is still attached, you do need to protect them because squirrels and other wildlife will actually come and clip these off and actually destroy your developing seedlings in an effort to get to those stored carbohydrates. You can expect in your first year that your shoot probably will get somewhere around about a foot tall and probably will have maybe 4 to maybe 6 leaves in that first year. And I see that we have about 20 or so questions here. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. And then I have a few more pictures if we have time at the end. So I appreciate everybody listening to me today, and hopefully you've taken away something that you can use in your landscape.
Thank you, Anne. We do have quite a few questions down here. Let's see. Let me get them up in front of me. Let's see. So Reese asks, why are horse chestnut so susceptible to leaf diseases? Not very ornamental when they're defoliated by late July and August.
Very true, very true. It's believed that the horse chestnut developed not in the presence of this particular infecting organism. And so as we know, when there's a separation in evolution, it generally leaves that host to be susceptible. And of course, horticulturists have not done any favors to this particular group of plants. We're doing selection for flowers, or we're doing selection for other things, when we probably should be doing selection for looking for resistance along as well.
Yeah, maybe. Kathleen says, I got a book certificate for Christmas. Is the Durr book still highly recommended, or do you have others?
Oh, I still think that's definitely the go-to book, whether you're looking at his latest book on trees, which is only trees. So if you actually want shrubs, you need to look at his manual for woody landscape plants. But the tree book has the most recent list of all of the cultivars and those cultivar attributes. So if you're definitely looking for something on trees specifically, there are lots of good stuff in there.
Good to know. Mark asked, it said inconsistent about using common and species names. Can you match them up for us? I think you hit some of those, but.
So Ohio is Aeschylus glabra. Flava is yellow buckeye. All right, I guess I should have said that the other one around. Yellow buckeye is Flava. Red buckeye is Pavia. And I should tell a quick story. So when I was about 12 years old, I had a horticultural mentor who introduced me to this tree and actually did what I sort of am recommending that you do about going and gathering up some seeds for, to start for your own yard. I call the plant Aesculitavia instead of Aeschylus Pavia. So it's easy to get lost in the Latin. And then painted buckeye, which is the one you're going to see predominantly in arboretums, is Sylvatica. So those are our North American. Bottle brush is Parviflora. So, and if anybody wants a list, I would be very happy. I spent about 6 years of my life studying both red buckeye and bottle brush, but kind of all of their commensurate friends as well. So always happy to help somebody out if they have questions.
Okay. Arlo says the buckeye trees in my woods don't produce nuts. Why is that?
So it could be that they have a predominance of staminate flowers. So when I did one of the studies I did at Dawes Arboretum, one of the trees that was initially selected for my doctoral work had only about 1/4% of all of the flowers on this tree were reproductively competent. And so if you have a limited number of panicles and the predominance of those are staminate, you could have really good flower production in spring and still not have any seeds to show for it in the fall. Okay. Needless to say, that tree was taken out of my study.
So Kathleen says, missed the term for flowers that set seeds.
So those are called complete or competent.
Okay. Rick says, what's the lifespan of Ohio buckeye?
So actually, they can typically live 80 to 100 years, at least according to some of the forestry texts that I looked at. Yellow buckeye actually is a little bit longer lived, quite a bit larger tree, of course.
Mark says, what's the evolutionary relationship between Aesculus and Castanea for chestnuts?
Very, very different. So if you look at where the branch pattern happens and the differences between them, Castaneaceae or Castanea, we're talking about something that has alternate leaf arrangements. It's considered more evolutionarily advanced. If you look at its seed coat, they've got it's very well armed in terms of its structure, as opposed to a lot of our Aesculus seeds. So Aesculus is considered to have evolved earlier than chestnuts, American or European.
Okay. Arlo has a couple I'll combine here. What to fertilize with, and should you prune the tree?
So fertilizing any tree in the landscape is something we typically don't do very often, because we know that rapid growth as one of those things that can actually make a plant more vulnerable to certain leaf diseases and insect damage. So we want to make sure that we're only providing nutrients that are needed. So I would definitely soil test first. And then definitely look at something that's not going to be high in nitrogen. So high in nitrogen is going to lead to very, very lush growth, which is basically going to invite aphids and all of their kin to come and feed. And what was the other part of the question, Kathy?
How should you prune?
Oh, in terms of pruning, certainly a young tree, you're going to want to make sure that you are pruning to get that good scaffolding structure. So you get that good branching and good symmetric arrangement. But as the trees begin to age, and especially as they begin to flower, their growth is going to slow down. It's part of what keeps Ohio Buckeye and Painted Buckeye small, is that they begin to bloom fairly young. And so it would only be if a branch is damaged by something or is crossing over that you definitely want to take those out. But otherwise, they don't require a whole lot of pruning.
Okay. Mary Lee says, have you heard Dr. David Kramer share how we came to be called the Buckeye State? He brings along the history, makes a distinction between yellow and Ohio, and shares the usage of the softwood into useful products.
I have not. Where I got our information about usage was out of a USDA publication that was talking about hardwoods.
Yeah. It gets used, you know, in specialty products. There's woodworkers that like the spalted look to it, the color. So, but production-wise, not too often. Arlo asks, how many nuts to flowers percentage on Ohio Buckeye?
Oh, generally we're looking at, so it's a bit like the Drake equation, if you're familiar with that, which is, you know, how many planets and how many of those planets may have life. So we actually calculated this for a couple of different Aesculus that I've worked with. Figure about 10% of those flowers. So if a panicle has 100 flowers, 10 of those may set seed. Of those 10 that could set seed, we're generally going to be looking at maybe 4. So if you estimate the number of panicles on the tree, that'll give you kind of a rough approximation. But that's also going to be importantly impacted by if we have periods of water stress, the plants will shed seeds. So realizing that they can only produce enough photosynthetes and move enough water. If we were talking about apples, we would call it June drop. And what you see in Aesculus is that probably 2/3 of those seeds will upsize off. Very distressing when it's your doctoral seeds that are upsizing off, but very much a natural phenomenon.
Chris says, how is red Buckeye with disease tolerance?
Okay, so it is more resistant to leaf blotch than what you would find with either Ohio or common horse chestnut. Mm-hmm. It is more susceptible than yellow, so it sits kind of in between there. Okay. It is susceptible to physiological leaf scorch. So as I said, it is a plant that you definitely does better if you can keep its head in the sunshine, but its roots in the cooling shade.
Okay. Thomas says, do you have a hypothesis why bottlebrush Buckeye has such limited distribution?
So it's really interesting when they look at the genetics of this particular plant. They're quite different from the other ones in the eastern half of the United States, and probably is most similar to California Buckeye, but is unique in several features. Because it produces such a small number of seeds, and even of those seeds, many of them are, they go ahead and germinate, but they don't produce viable seedlings. It reproduces clonally. So that's going to definitely limit its, it's got several genetic bottlenecks. So that's really going to limit its its spread.
Okay.
And typically those seeds are going to also be found in similar sites to where we would find red buckeyes and painted buckeyes. They do best when they're getting at least some shade as well.
Anonymous asks, is red horse chestnut disease resistant?
Absolutely not. It gets it every bit as badly as common horse chestnut, which is unfortunate because that certainly limits its use in the landscape. It's got that wow factor in May, and by July, instead of saying wow, you're saying whoa.
Jean asks scientific names for diseases. I think did you have some of those in there?
Colornoldia Aesculus is leaf blotch. And I certainly can put together a quick list for everybody so that you'll have both the organism and the disease that it ends up producing.
Okay. Bonnie says a beekeeper once told her that buckeyes kill honeybees. Is that true, or is it that the honey isn't that good?
So I have heard conflicting things about this. Some folks will say that it is toxic to honeybees, although given the number of honeybees I see visiting, it's kind of hard to believe that if it was really truly toxic that we would see as much activity as we do.
Okay. Thomas says red buckeye also has a southern distribution, but I understand it can be grown here. Why that distribution, and is there anything that can help them thrive here? I can tell you I'm in northern Morrow County, and I probably have a half dozen planted around the edge of the woods and in the landscape, and they do awesome. So,
oh yeah, they thrive. They're perfectly hardy. And with the integration of a lot of the germplasm north to south, certainly we have quite a few that are hardy here. So I've never had a hardiness problem with any of the reds. So you're good to go for sure.
Bonnie asks, can you eat dried buckeyes?
No. So the Essen and esculin are going to be actually concentrated as you dry those seeds. So you would actually have to do what our native peoples did, which is they took the seeds, removed not only the husk, but the outer shell. They leached those seeds and then ground them into flour ultimately, but definitely not something that we would recommend.
Katie just is saying, thank you so much for an informative and educational lecture. She's learned a lot.
Good, good. That was my goal for today, is that you would walk away from this knowing a bit more about the Aesculus that you come across in both our woods and in our landscapes.
Reese says, any thoughts on why we have no native Aesculus here in Ashtabula County?
Good question. That is one of the counties where Ohio Buckeye is not native. It definitely can be naturalized there. It may date back to some of the glaciation that took place. So obviously there were differences in how the glaciers moved across northern Ohio, especially.
So Thomas has a comment, Buckeye's pretty good for carving, which is true. It has blonde wood with little contrast or grain, cuts fairly well. It was used in the Civil War era for prosthetic limbs.
I did not know that.
It and willow were both used for prosthetic limbs. Barry says, I've seen a couple of these. So a tree guide I have mentions Octandra as yellow buckeye. Is this the same as Pavia? The answer is no, but.
So actually, if you go back as recently as the 1980s, you are going to find Aeschylus Octandra. Taxonomists, I think, enjoy driving horticulturists,
all of us,
and the rest of us crazy by changing names. But there's something about it's called the right of first description. And so when the first time a plant is described with a particular name, it's given priority. And so if you go way, way, way back, you will find Flava. And so that actually predates Octandra. And so Flava is is correct, but very, very often you're going to find references to Aeschylus octandra, which is yellow buckeye.
Okay. Josh says, how many known extinct species of Aesculus are there? You referenced one in North Dakota.
So there's one in North Dakota. There is another one that's pretty well characterized out in the Pacific Northwest up in the Washington area. And then at least 3 in Japan, 1 in Korea, 1 in Russia. So there's actually, we know that Aeschylus at one time were far more widespread than what we see in the distribution today.
Sue asks, can you control leaf blotch or anthracnose when they're small trees?
So you can use a chlorodactonyl product. So that's the active ingredient for controlling leaf blotch. You would need to start doing that shortly after leaf emergence, and then at a 10-day to 2-week time frame, depending on what our precipitation looks like. Typically, we don't recommend that, but that would be if you had a high value specimen that you needed to establish, that would be what you could use. It's important for the long term that you always clean up your Aesculus leaves, because those leaves can be the source for reinfections next spring. So if you know that you're wanting to maintain this and you've had issues with leaf blotch, be sure to pick up those leaves as they're upsized off.
Thomas wants you to know that he ate one in 5th grade. So he's still here. And Janine says Stark County loves red buckeyes. And I agree. I love the hummingbird thing is huge. I mean, it's fun to watch the hummingbirds on them. Kathleen said, what did they use to leach the seeds?
So because both Essen and Esculin are water soluble, that's what they would use. They would use a water and then leach it through a set of leaves and into a sand pit. So there's a really good video that's out. University of California has it on California buckeye, and it's native people's use of California buckeye. So,
okay. Marjorie asks zones for red and bottle brush buckeyes.
Both red and bottle brush are hardy to zone 5, and as far south as zone 9.
And she also asks, do buckeyes tolerate moist soil in low areas?
So actually they do tolerate moist soil much more so than they do in dry soil. Mm-hmm. And that's actually good use, particularly for red buckeyes, is if you can site them right and put them into a rain garden, they will actually do quite well in a rain garden.
You usually find Ohio buckeye in the kind of understory and a bottomland area in woodlands, so they definitely can tolerate the moisture. Okay. Marnie, I don't know, were you watching the chat? Is there anything there we have to?
Yeah, no, I think everybody that entered a question into the chat entered them into the Q&A. So the only thing is not too long ago in the Q&A, and I think maybe you were talking about a book, and Una was requesting that we type out the name of that book. I don't know if it was one of the Durr books. Sorry, I missed it.
I was going to say, I was about to reach for it, but I don't have it. It's in my office, which of course,
which is a problem.
I'm working from home today, so.
Right. If you just want to say what it, or you don't remember what it is that the problem?
So if they just search for Durr, right?
Yeah.
Is it? I'll reach for my phone and see if I can pull up the title of his book.
I was going to say,
maybe trees.
So Marnie, if you want to stop recording, and I can get the.
Yep. Okay.